So, good evening. Today is March the 19th of 2025. Right now it is right about 10 minutes past 8 p.m. in Central Standard Time from the United States, from the heartland. And the topic of our video today is the JFK files, which have been now released for the better part with all the redactions removed. And I went online, I had a little bit of time today, and I was able to look through some of these. The total of this has like almost 2,200 PDF files with a total of 62,000 pages. Just that you have an idea on how big this is. So I looked at some documents in the beginning, and then in the middle, and then in the end of the list. And I got one, interestingly enough, I found the very last one, which has the identity number or record number ending in 10124. So when you go to the list of the archives.gov under the releases 2025 for the JFK stuff, you will find this document here. And this was, or it contains 4 memos, which were written by different members of the Department of State and then circulated through other departments and say like the Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of the Army, and so on and so on. This particular file came out of a batch. The originator for this is the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And Cyrus R. Vance was the Secretary of Defense for Lyndon B. Johnson. So this was probably carried over because the papers are dated earlier than this. And the reason why I'm using this very last document here, or the last PDF document, is because the author, Mr. John Grimmins, the coordinator of Cuban Affairs, Department of State, wrote this on September 21st, 1963, about 2 months, roughly exactly 2 months before JFK was assassinated. And I guess the Warren Commission had gotten hold of this here at one point or another. And just to let you see on what this looks like, this would be page 1, 2, 3, 4. They didn't do a good job with the way they scanned this, because it looks like that they're slightly upside down. And then they have the redaction removed, and then they put the previous version of this with the redactions on it. So you have, the whole document is, I think, 16 pages long. So you have 8 pages original with no redaction in it, and then some of them do have the redaction in it. It's a little bit complicated to read because they're not clearly separated, but I want to give you an idea. So what they did here is they wrote memos, and one of them, the first memo we have, was actually, which is part of this, which is actually dated December 31st, 1963, was Colonel Haig, Office of the General Counsel, DA, Subject Psychological Programs Subcommittee, Cuba. And here we can see, for instance, that item number 4 under 2A, so this would be 2A4 down here. Let me see if I can show you this. It says Brazil over here, and that was redacted in the original releases, which is the same page here. This is what we got so far when they were previously released. And this what made this so interesting. Now, I can see, looking at these pages here, I can see clearly why they had this redacted, because some of the things discussed are basically detailing particular government action or programs they had to combat socialism, communism, and that sort of stuff, and the collusions in these countries. So I want to give you this example here. This particular memorandum from Colonel Haig, which he wrote December 31st, 1963, JFK was already assassinated. He was assassinated November 22nd. So this was just about 6-7 weeks after this. And it says here, CIA to continue black propaganda operations in, and then the name of the country, which used to be concealed or redacted, which suggests postponement of the meeting. Here now we know that it was in Brazil. And basically what this is telling us here is the involvement of the U.S. government in other countries, in the interference in local or national politics abroad. So this is kind of why this was all redacted for all these years, and now we can clearly see this, where and what they actually did. But the one memorandum is actually the one which is of by far more importance, is the one from John H. Crimmins, which was written on September 21st, 1963. This is not a smoking gun or anything. The subject on this memo was the Interdepartmental Coordinating Committee of Cuban Affairs, possible retaliatory actions by the Castro government. And the reference memorandum from the Coordinator of Cuban Affairs, Department of State, subject is above, 13 September 63. In response to the reference memorandum outlined below is the status of existing contingency plans for those priority situations agreed upon at our meeting of September 12, 1963. The numbering of the paragraphs below corresponds to the format utilized in the attachment to reference memorandum and includes those actions for which Department of Defense specific or related military contingency plans exist. So because of the whole circus with Cuba really started, first of all, with the U.S. invasion of the Bay of Pigs, which failed. That program or that invasion was planned or first thought out or approved of by President Eisenhower, and then Kennedy took this over and they started that. Then came Fidel Castro with his revolution, and then came the Cuban Missile Crisis as a result out of this. And as a result of these three things that you have to know, the U.S. was very worried about it, that Cuban operatives who had immigrated either to the United States or to Latin American countries or to the Bahamas would cause terroristic type of activity. And also, we know that Guantanamo had been there, the U.S. naval installation, which is directly on that island of Cuba itself. And this is what this thing is in reference to. So this is now after Fidel Castro came to power and Batista had been removed by Castro, and they had made it through the Cuban Missile Crisis barely at this point. So the tensions were extremely high between the Soviet Union and the United States. And this is why this paper is so important. And there was a lot of things redacted in this particular memorandum before it was released yesterday without the redactions. And they're talking now for one program or one situation was what the military, the U.S. military was concerned, was the harassment of Guantanamo, cutting off the water supply to the U.S. naval base. And here they're saying a minimum of approximately 20 days of supply of water is maintained in reserve storage at the naval base. Provision is made for the emergency, excuse me, the emergency resupply of water by tanker, by ship basically, which would require a maximum of 18 days and which would be implemented on order of CINCLNTFLT. So that is a particular program group within the military which would then supply that water. In addition, evacuation of non-essential personnel in 24 hours or less can be accomplished if directed. Closing access to the base by Cuban workers who commute. So they were playing out several scenarios here. Purpose of substantially reducing the time required for the U.S. fighter aircraft to reach the scene, such overflight. So there's now all sorts of military scenarios here in what they're pointing out, how the U.S. military would respond to this when the, Cubans or the Soviets would fly close by the military installations, and how they would respond. And if, say, like Cuban snipers were to fire into the U.S. naval installation at Guantanamo Bay, here they're saying if just one soldier basically or one subject gets killed, then they would not take any further action. If there's multiple sniper attacks within the same period of time, basically, then they would constitute this as an assault. And the most important one is here, actions against targets in the United States. This would include now President Kennedy or any high-ranking military government official, from the president all the way down. Sabotage or terroristic bombings, this is what they came up with. The level of intensity of such actions contemplated within the context of the paper is not considered to exceed the capabilities of law enforcement agencies to control. There are military contingency plans to protect against this type of activity at much higher level of intensity. So what they are basically saying is, if this is terroristic bombings, then the U.S. military would take over. But anything less than a terroristic bombing or a sabotage, in this case an assassination attempt, that would be under the control of the local police departments. This is what this paragraph tells us. And this explains why Dallas was not fully prepared, because the police department in Dallas either didn't know that the government basically expected them to protect the president and the other members who traveled with him, and they did not fully rely on the Secret Service, for personal protection. This is basically what that is, because this would be within the capabilities of law enforcement agencies. So you would have the FBI and the Secret Service, law enforcement, and you would have the Sheriff's Department for Dallas County, and you would have had the police department in Dallas. Those agencies should have prevented the assassination of John F. Kennedy. This is clearly outlined here. And like I said, this was determined 2 months before he was assassinated, of who was responsible for what. If there was bombings, terroristic bombings, like we had similar to 9/11, where they used aircraft as weapons, that would have been within the responsibility of the U.S. military. Anything smaller than that would have been shifted down to the local law enforcement, either federal or local, on a state level, city level, or county level. And the reason for that being is that what they are saying basically, or before they even knew of Lee Harvey Oswald, was what we need to know about Lee Harvey Oswald is the fact that he was in the Marines. He was a marksman. He was basically a sniper. He was, trained for that, so he was very good at it. And then he wanted to get out of the military, out of the Marines, and he told them that he had to care for his elderly, sick mother. So they discharged him because of family, emergency. And he winded up actually flying or going over to Europe. He went to the Netherlands first, I believe. And then from there he went, I think he went to London first, to Great Britain, to the United Kingdom. And he went from there he got a visa, he went to Finland, and from Finland he went to the Soviet Union on a tourist visa. He then told the Russian officials, or the Soviet officials at that time, that he wanted to immigrate, he wanted to defect from the United States, he wanted to live in the Soviet Union, which he did then. And he lived there for 3 years, and he got married, and then he came back to the United States with his wife. And he had then contacts in Dallas, because he settled in Dallas, Texas, with certain groups which were close to the communist, socialist-oriented political movements here in the United States and abroad via the Soviet Union and Latin America. And of course, after the assassination, they found that out very quickly of who he was. And then the Dallas Police Department basically failed to protect him because he got then assassinated the same day or the next day while he was in their care, custody, and control. This is how crazy this is. In other words, the whole thing was hinging on who was responsible for what. And this is one of these papers which basically confirmed it. And this is similar to what we had with President Trump when he almost died last year in Pennsylvania, in Butler, Pennsylvania. When he got shot at, you had the Secret Service with their counter snipers up there, but the local police department was totally unprepared. But here, thank God, with President Trump, we had a assassin who was not very good at what he did. Whereas with Lee Harvey Oswald, you had a trained sniper who had the highest, decorations from the Marines on top of it for marksmanship. So this is quite a different. If that fellow in Butler, Pennsylvania, would have had the same training as Lee Harvey Oswald had, President Trump would be no longer with us. That would have been one shot and he would have been gone. And thank God that did not materialize. But this is how crazy this is. But this is the information, what we can read now, which was redacted for so long. The other thing I found interesting too was the one situation with the Cuban exiles in the Bahamas. And now I need to look at this here. Yeah. Attack on staging areas employed by exiles in the Caribbean, meaning the Bahamas primarily. With regard to Castro attacks on areas in Latin America, plans exist for the U.S. military to respond to requests for assistance by Latin American governments subject to U.S. governmental approval. This was all redacted until yesterday. There is also an arrangement for the interchange of information between the U.S. Coast Guard and British naval forces with regard to possible staging areas which may be used by exiles in the Bahamas. So we know now that it was not just the U.S. military, but also the Coast Guard and the British naval forces who were allied in this. And this was all redacted until yesterday. And this was the preceding issue they had discussed before they went to this terroristic bombings in the responsibilities of the different entities here, government entities involved in the law enforcement side. So what they're basically saying is the Dallas Police Department should have made themselves aware of people like Lee Harvey Oswald, who had defected to the Soviet Union, were aligned with the communist socialist idea, could be under circumstances very potentially dangerous, especially with Lee Harvey Oswald being a trained sniper, and they should have monitored him, and that apparently did not happen until afterwards when this actually came out. And this is very typical. So this is basically what you got over 62,000 pages is what the Warren Commission looked at, was primarily of who was responsible, who was not responsible, and what government programs, like I had outlined here, or agreements they had with other nations, was to combat terroristic activity. At that point, primarily it was these scenarios from communist, members of communist and socialist parties abroad, or maybe even from within, like with Lee Harvey Oswald. Other than that, I don't think there's going to come anything new out of it. Probably some American citizens who are reading this, they're going to be embarrassed about how their government interacted on the global stage over all these years, with interfering in local politics or national politics in other countries. That collusion, what we call it, with Hillary and, with the WikiLeaks there, with the emails and that sort of stuff, and then the Russian interference, Russian collusion here. And but here you can clearly see that with their, what did they call it, the black program, to keep black propaganda operations in Brazil. This was, like I said, this was in December 1963. So the United States had their hands and fingers into many other countries. So did the Soviet Union, and so did other countries intermingling in national politics all across the world. So this is nothing new with these collusions. But other than that, we really have not learned, at least I haven't, of anything else. I found it helpful, finally, to actually be able to read this without the redaction in it, because I figured this, for a long time, that not just the U.S. government, but other governments interfering in other countries where they have an economic or social interest in or political interest in, for a wide variety of reasons, mostly economical, or, passages like with ships to go through, and or naval stations, military bases in other countries where they are stationed, or where they have these kind of military operations. Then they usually get involved or monitor this very closely. In the end, this entire Warren report, these 62,000 pages or so, is basically for people who are really into James Bond kind of stuff. So who spied on who had what kind of undercover covert operations going in what country, by what government agency, and this whole blah, blah, forwards and backwards from the Cold War days is basically outlined. There's no smoking gun in there other than that. And they found out that Lee Harvey Oswald lived in the Soviet Union for 3 years because he defected and then he came back. Now, there's 3 theories here, or how should we call them? Not theories, but 3 ideas basically on who was behind it. One group believes that it was the American mafia because they got him elected and they didn't get what they wanted, so they killed him, and they got Lee Harvey Oswald on this. Then you have the other group which believed that came out of the communist background because of the association Lee Harvey Oswald had, even after he came back from the Soviet Union, here with Russian nationals who are, or national Soviet operatives in the United States he had contact with, and that sort of stuff. I believe that to be the case. And then the other one, they think it was Lyndon B. Johnson himself who basically ordered the killing on him, because one of the statements John F. Kennedy made was, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, in the very beginning of his presidency. And as we know, Lyndon B. Johnson turned the country in the other direction, where you should ask what your country can do for you, with all the entitlement which came out of this program he started as the Great Society, what we call it, and everything else, what came with it. So this is how these three theories were born, and the Warren Commission basically was inconclusive because there was no direct evidence that the Russian operative or the Soviet operative told Lee Harvey Oswald to kill JFK. But they think because it's nowhere written, or there's no audio recordings or anything of that available, of that conversation, if they ever had this, which is possible. And then he was paid. They also couldn't, then he went and assassinated JFK. But there was also no money transaction which they could trace back, for instance, to that Soviet operative in Dallas, where that operative would have paid Lee Harvey Oswald, some money, say like $5,000 or $10,000 for that assassination. So they never found money or paperwork or any of that stuff linking these two together, other than that they know from eyewitnesses that Lee Harvey Oswald had contact with that Soviet operative. That's pretty much it for you for today. A little bit of a different topic, but I thought I'm going to bring it up since I had a little bit of time to look at this. And we will see what the experts are going to find in these documents, if they find anything new. If you're watching this video here from abroad, you probably, if you have the time and you want to go to 2,200 PDF files, you may find your own country, and you will find out of what the U.S. did in your country or didn't do during the Cold War, primarily in terms of programs and influencing the local and national politics in your country. With that, you have a great night.